Hello, hello, hello.
Hi, hey
Hi.
Nisha.
Hi, Hermi. Good morning.
Good
Good morning, good
good
evening,
evening.
good afternoon.
Yes,
The true globalization side effects.
a very warm welcome to everyone to our special show.
Yeah,
We have a
let's
very
start our
special
regular
guest
subject.
waiting for us. Yeah, not a regular subject. All the way from Borneo, uh, without sleeping. He's waiting for us.
That's so sweet of him.
Yes, so let's welcome Shane to the show. Let me add. Hey,
Hi,
Hey,
evening. How are you?
evening, good evening.
Great. Really nice to be here.
it's an honor for us. Thank you.
Uh,
Thank you for coming on our show.
no problem. It's a really a pleasure to do this. Many thanks for the invite.
A lot of people are waiting to hear from you, your experience, your views about conservation, wildlife, everything.
Great. Well, I don't know how much I can fit in 30 minutes, but we'll try to cram it in.
Sure, sure. So, just a short brief about yourself, please, before we go to the presentation.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm actually originally from California. My background is in biology, and I worked as an environmental educator in California parks. And I moved to Borneo. Let's see, it's 26 years ago now, and this has been my home ever
Okay.
since. And yeah, it's I really found that so much inspiration from working in the rainforest that it has completely changed the direction of my career. And this is actually what I wanted to share with you this evening in my talk is how I've found some inspiration in the rainforest, and hopefully other people can do the same. I think it's, as a kid growing up in North America, I always dreamed of going to the tropics. You want to see the amazing insects, the amazing animals, and so living next to the rainforest, it's like a dream come true, and it really is. If you have a passion for biodiversity, it's one of the most amazing places to work in.
Great. That's a great thought that anybody can listen to. So, Shane, can we go through the pictures and your talk, like
Your
presentation?
Sure. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna share the screen now.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Can you see my screen?
yes,
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right. Let's
yeah,
start this. And you can see the slides now.
yes.
Yes.
Okay. Here we go.
There is a small banner that is coming. Maybe you
All
can
right.
hide
Let me
that.
see if I can hide. Oh, and now everything disappeared again. Okay. Okay. Do I have you now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Great. All right. Yes. So, yeah, the title of my talk this evening is Wild Borneo, and basically, I want to share something a little bit different this evening. I know that your fantastic webinar series, you often have people talking about techniques, tips and tricks for taking
Yes.
photos. And for any of you in the audience out there who haven't tuned into Paws Trails webinar series, I highly recommend it. There's some very talented photographers sharing techniques, on the forum there. And but what I want to talk about tonight is a little bit different. Rather than talking about a particular technique, I'm going to be talking about a particular place. And this, of course, is the tropical island of Borneo. And this is a place that's very special for me because, as I mentioned, I moved to the other side of the planet from California, coming to Southeast Asia, and I had a profound effect on my life. Um, I used to work as an environmental educator, but it wasn't until I really set foot into the rainforest myself that I embraced photography as my profession, as a hobby, and I basically fell in love with it. And so in that sense, Borneo is the reason why I do what I do today. And I know that we have probably a lot of photographers tuning in tonight from all over the world. Some people specialize in photographing wildlife in the Arctic, from the plains of Africa. But my particular specialty is tropical rainforest. And so what I want to do this evening is to share with you some tidbits that I've learned over the past 26 years of living and working here. And of course, I want to talk about some of what makes Borneo so unique and how it presents some very special opportunities for wildlife photographers. I also want to talk about what are some of the obstacles you need to overcome when you're photographing in an environment like the tropical rainforests of Borneo. And of course, for those of you in the audience who may be planning a trip to come to Borneo in the future, I want to give you a few tips on not only places to potentially visit on your trip, but also some tips on how to get the most out of your visit to the rainforest.
That's great.
Okay, so here's this is the canopy of the Bornean rainforest. And for those of you who don't know where Borneo is, this is the third largest tropical island in the world. You can see it's just off the coast of Southeast Asia here. Singapore is on the map, Philippines up to the northeast, and it's basically at the edge of the whole Indonesian archipelago. To give you an idea of size, Borneo is actually 3 times larger than the entire UK. So it's a very, very large island. We call it an island, but when you're in the interior of Borneo, it basically feels like a continent. It's vast. And of course, it's completely tropical. As you can see here, the faint green line across the center of the screen, that's the equator right there. So the island straddles the equator, and it's about as tropical as you can get. Now, if you look closely, I'm not sure if viewers can see the province names on the map there, but there are basically 3 different countries that have territories on the island of Borneo. There are the 2 states of Malaysia, Sarawak and Sabah. I'm going to move my mouse pointer here. Can you see my mouse pointer if I do this?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so this is Sarawak here. This is the state I live in. This is Sabah up here. So these are 2 states of Malaysia. Then there's the tiny country of Brunei, nestled right in between here in Sarawak. And then the whole southern half of the island is owned by Indonesia. And these are several provinces called Kalimantan. And here you can see the city of Kuching. This is where I'm based, where I'm talking from right now.
Okay.
Now, if you can see the yellow lines on the map, these are the major roads in Borneo. And that's actually being quite a bit generous. A lot of those roads, I would scarcely call them roads. But as you can see, the interior of Borneo is just blank. And it's a very difficult place to travel. Most of the cities are on the coast. The main roads are on the coast, but getting into the interior of the island is a completely different matter. And I'll be sharing more about that in a little bit. So now when you compare Borneo with a lot of other well-known tropical islands like, say, Madagascar and Sri Lanka come to mind, Borneo is different from those in that it doesn't have a wet side and a dry side to the island. Borneo is wet everywhere. In fact, before there was widespread forest clearance caused by people, the rainforest pretty much stretched across the entire island. So it's really as wet and tropical as you can get. There are very few, there's very little annual cycles in most parts of Borneo. Some months you may get a little less rain than other months, but it's pretty much rainy year round. Okay, now this brings me to one of the first things I want to talk about the benefits of, or the pluses of, photographing in Borneo, and that this tropical rainforest actually has all the best ingredients for a diversity of life. And biologists would almost call this the perfect storm. It's warm, it has rainfall year round, an abundance of sunlight, and these are all the ingredients you need to have for just an incredible assortment of life forms. So biodiversity itself is one of the biggest draws for being a wildlife photographer in Borneo. This stick insect, for example, shown here, this is just one of nearly 400 species of stick insects that have so far been recorded from Borneo. And that's more than any other region of similar size on the planet. So and there's a lot of families of organisms that reach their pinnacle of diversity in Borneo. Now, one of the best ways to look at the biodiversity in Borneo is to consider the trees. Now, there's a lot of talk about biodiverse hotspots around the planet. But what I want to show you with this is Borneo really is almost on another level. When you look at rainforests in tropical Africa, Central America, Madagascar, there's been a lot of study plots that are examining tree diversity. And a lot of these come up with very impressive totals, 500 species, 800 species for these forest plots. But in Borneo, one forest plot has been measured to have nearly 1,200 species of trees in an area just about half a square kilometer. That's less than a quarter square mile. So this, in fact, is one of the highest diversities of tree species on the planet. And the only one other place that actually is comparable in terms of tree diversity, and that's the upper Amazon basin in Ecuador. And nowhere else really comes close. And of course, this is just the trees. But when we talk about the diversity of trees, we have to realize that there's a cascading effect on the biodiversity of all the other organisms in the forest. The insects are more diverse because many species specialize on just a single species of tree, and so on and so forth. So it's an indicator of the broad levels of biodiversity that you can find in these rainforests. And it's one of the reasons that makes Borneo so special. One of the other things that is remarkable about Borneo is the number of species that have not yet been documented. Now, we do a lot of expeditions in Borneo, and to be honest, it's hard to recall a single trip into some forested area in Borneo that we have not come across a species that has not that's undescribed. So these are discoveries that happen all the time. In fact, there are so many new species being discovered in the rainforests of Borneo that biologists, frankly, don't have time to keep up with naming them all. There's a backlog of organisms that still don't have names. This frog right here is an example of one that we finally were able to name. This was named just last year. It's a very unusual endemic frog that's only found on a few of the highest mountains in northern Borneo, where it lives inside of carnivorous pitcher plants. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these micro-endemic habitats harbor species that are found nowhere else. I'm just going to share a few other examples here of species that were new to science. This is a blue-legged tarantula that we discovered just a few years ago in Borneo. A new species of bird. This is particularly remarkable because birds are a group of organisms that are normally very well studied. And yes, there are a number of new species of birds being described when a species gets split, but finding a completely new species of bird that's totally different from all the other known species of bird, it's a pretty rare event. And that's what this bird was. It was just published, if I'm not mistaken, 2 years ago. It's called the spectacled flower pecker, and it looks somewhat unremarkable. It's a small grayish bird, but it had eluded uh, detection from bird watchers for who knows how long, and it probably because it's very rare and it lives only in the top reaches of the canopy of the forest. So very, very difficult to find. Finally, some ornithologists were able to collect a specimen to describe it. There's a lot of species also that, although they may not be new, they have been what we say lost to science for a long time. This plant here is a non-photosynthesizing plant. These are flowers that sprout from the forest floor. And this plant is so rare that it had never been seen since it was originally discovered over 150 years ago in one of the national parks on the northern coast of Borneo. And just a few years ago, some botanists who were studying these plants finally managed to track down this plant. It's very small, very inconspicuous, and it's only above ground for a few weeks a year. So very difficult to see. I was fortunate to be able to visit the site and get this photo. So a lot of these rediscoveries are equally as exciting as discovering a new species. This is a new species of leaf-legged katydid that was just described a couple years ago, also from northern Borneo. This is an unusual circumstance where these katydids were actually described from photographs alone. A specimen was not available. So a photo and recording served as a voucher for the specimen. There's also species that are well known, but are so elusive and so shy and so rare that no photos are in existence of them. This is a photo of the Sarawak langur, the black morph, of which this is the first ever DSLR photo of this species, which I captured 4 or 5 years ago. And it's an extremely shy mammal, very, very difficult to see, let alone capture an image of. It's also critically endangered, with possibly as few as 200 remaining in the wild. So definitely on the top list for some of the most endangered primates in the world. Now, some of the challenges for photographing in Borneo are, of course, the weather. Now, when you first step foot outside of an airplane, when you arrive in Sarawak or Sabah, you feel it right in your face. You're right on the equator, and the humidity you can almost cut it with a knife. So Borneo, a lot of parts of the island receive well over 4 or even 5 meters of rain a year. And as I mentioned before, there's usually no distinct dry season in a lot of these regions, particularly in the interior. So rain is always a possibility, no matter what you do or where you go in Borneo. So it's something you always have to be prepared for. Of course, the humidity as well also presents its problems. People who have photographed themselves before in tropical rainforest, you find lenses and cameras fogging up. Fungus is something you always have to be prepared to fight. We always travel on these expeditions carrying silica gel and desiccating agents to keep the gear dry. So it's a constant threat to your equipment. Of course, the high rainfall also means there are difficulties with transportation as well. So if you recall the photo, the map I showed earlier, how few roads there are going into the interior, there are networks of logging roads, but of course they are not for your average sedan. And these vehicles, this is a Toyota Hilux here and Land Rovers in the back, even they have difficulty negotiating some of these roads. So it's always a challenge getting to the interior. And most of the times you don't even have the luxury of having roads like this. So a lot of the interior can only be accessed by going upriver in boats. And of course, this presents its own challenges as well. But when the river gets too small, you either have to drag the boat up or you set off on foot. Now, there's some other challenges that the forest of Borneo presents as well to photography. And one in particular I'd like to bring up is the height of the rainforest canopy. Now, this is true in any rainforest around the world.
Yeah.
A lot of the biomass, a lot of the animals, the birds, the arboreal mammals, they're all high up in the canopy. This is where a great portion of the biodiversity is living. But in Borneo, this is a particular problem because the Bornean rainforest is actually the tallest rainforest in the world. When we look at canopy heights, Central America, 40 to 60 meters, Africa, maybe a little more, Madagascar, I think 30, 40 meters, if I recall correctly. The Bornean rainforest towers above all of these. In a lot of places, it's at least 80 meters tall. And recently, they have discovered a few trees that are nearly 100 meters in height. So these are forests that are so tall, they almost rival some of the famous redwood forests of the Pacific Northwest. So very, very tall trees. And this not only means that it's very, very difficult to see anything in the canopy at all, but also that you're working on the forest floor, which is very dark. So here you can see some of the enormous trees that cast a lot of shade on the forest floor. And for anybody that's photographed in these environments, you realize that light is a luxury. And you're pushing your camera to the limits, unless you're using supplementary lighting like flashes, of course. So there are a lot of cases where photographing organisms in the rainforest understory, you're needing to use very slow shutter speeds. This means tripods or high ISOs, but you're always struggling to get enough light for your photos. Of course, the dim light of the rainforest understory has certain advantages as well, particularly at dusk when things start to get dark. Things like these glowing mushrooms are something you would never see in a brighter lit area or earlier in the day. Another thing about the rainforest understory is you always have these companions with you. These are, of course, the Bornean forest leeches. We have many different species. Those of you who have been in rainforests in India, Sri Lanka, or Thailand, I'm sure you're familiar with the leeches. Yeah. Actually, a lot of people, when they come to Borneo for the first time, this is one of their biggest worries. They're always looking out for the leeches. What do we do if we get a leech on them? But you just have to spend a little time in the forest, and you get very used to them. And on the plus side, they can be a little bit of a nuisance, but leeches, they cause no known diseases. I'd much rather be bitten by a leech than a mosquito, because you always have the danger of malaria or other illnesses from mosquitoes. And to be perfectly honest, after having spent a bit of time in tropical rainforests in places like Costa Rica, where there's lots of sandflies and other things that bite you, the rainforests of Borneo are pretty tame in terms of bloodsuckers. So I'll take leeches quite happily over any of the others. Another challenge to photographing in Borneo is flight distance. And by this, I mean the shyness of the wildlife. One of the unfortunate things about a lot of regions in Borneo is there is still a lot of indigenous people living in these areas that actively hunt. And while this may not drive any of the species to extinction, it does cause a lot of the animals to be extremely wary of people. And there are a lot of areas where you can go into the forest, and unless you're being extremely quiet or using tools like a hide, you will never see the animals there, because monkeys, which may be a pest in other areas, if it's an area that has been actively hunted, these monkeys will flee at any distance, at several hundred meters away. The first sound you make, and they're gone. So a lot of the forest animals, of course, have much better hearing than we do, and they know we're there long before we know they are there, and they're gone before you can see them. So this means you have to be approach your subjects very delicately in Borneo. Ground birds like this endemic blue-headed pitta, they're also very shy, particularly, and they take a lot of time to approach. A lot of the photos you may see on the internet of orangutan, usually these are photographed in areas where the orangutan have been rehabilitated, released back into the wild, near rescue centers. And honestly, these are great places for photography. You can capture a lot of wonderful images of orangutan that way. But to see a truly wild orangutan deep in the Borneo rainforest, it's a much more difficult thing to do, because orangutan also can be extremely wary of people. And again, they have very good senses. They know when you're approaching, and they're long gone before you get there. One of the tools we use a lot in the rainforest of Borneo, and is pretty much essential to capture photos of shy, especially terrestrial animals, is camera traps. And I don't mean just their average trail cams. These are custom-built DSLR camera traps that are capable of capturing high-resolution images of animals. And this is pretty much the only way you're going to get good shots of some of these animals, and a particularly rare species. This is one of Borneo's rarest carnivores. It's called the Hoses civet. It's endemic to Borneo, and it's only found in the higher mountains in the northern part of the island. You have to set up camera traps. Sometimes we wait weeks before we can get images like this. This was the first ever DSLR shot of a Hoses civet that I'm aware of. Was only able to capture this shot in, this was early 2020, just before we had to shut down all our field trips because of the pandemic.
Okay.
Camera traps are also useful up in trees. This is a cave nectar bat approaching the flowers of a wild durian fruit tree. And in this case, the camera was suspended or clamped to one of the branches of the tree with the flashes as well. And I was able to capture multiple images of the bats coming back repeatedly to these flowers throughout the night. And of course, as with the title slide, this photo of the clouded leopard was also taken with a DSLR camera trap. This particular image is a very special one for me because it took several years to capture this shot. This is in Danam Valley, a very famous wildlife area in northeastern Borneo, and an area that I've had the opportunity to work in quite a bit over the years. Several years prior to getting this photo, I had set some camera traps in some of the remote trails of Danam Valley. And after a few months of camera trapping on multiple trails, I was able to find a trail that had a lone male clouded leopard walking repeatedly down this path, following the same direction, the same path, at the same time of day every week. It was almost as if this male was patrolling the limits of his territory, probably scent marking along the trail. And he was very, very regular here. As I said, the same time of day, about every week, he would come past this trail. Now, at the time, I had my camera trap set up in a different location than what you see here. And the only photos I was able to obtain were some lateral shots where you can see the leopard's flanks. And they were okay, but I wasn't completely pleased with the photo because you couldn't see all the features of his face, and you couldn't see his eyes very well. So a few years later, I was back in Danam Valley, and I had another few camera traps with me. And I actually wondered if this clouded leopard was still in the same area. So I went out to the same trail and I set up a camera trap, but this time I framed the scene a little bit differently. I positioned the camera trap facing the trail where the leopard walked. Rather than getting a flank shot, I wanted to get a photo of it walking towards the camera. And sure enough, after a week, the leopard came by following the same path. And I could tell from the individual spots on this animal that it's the same male leopard that was on my camera trap 2 years prior. So really telling about how habitual some of these animals can be and how important it is to understand the habits of your subject if you want to obtain a particular photograph. Actually, I was very lucky to get that shot of the clouded leopard because the very next photo on the camera trap was this. This is a Borneo pygmy elephant, and which also inhabit the forest in Danum Valley. And what you can't see with the elephant's trunk here is it is knocking over the infrared sensor of my camera trap. So this is the last photo that that camera trap was able to take. If the leopard had come after the elephant, I wouldn't have gotten the shot. So there are a lot of hazards as well. Fortunately, this elephant was very kind. He was just smelling the trap and he just knocked it over and left. But there are a lot of other incidents. I've had colleagues who do camera trapping for research, and they have had camera traps basically pulverized by elephants or torn apart by sun bears. So there are a lot of environmental hazards, shall we say, for camera trapping in Borneo. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some tips for places to go if you plan on visiting Borneo. Some of you may have been to the island already, but for those of you who are daydreaming about a trip to Borneo, my advice is to make it happen. I know a lot of us have been stuck at home for the majority of the past 2 years, and a lot of people are really itching to get out there back into the forest. And actually, I'm very happy to announce that Malaysia just made an announcement that they will be opening their borders to foreigners in April with no quarantine required. So it's actually, it's a great time to consider coming to visit Borneo. Of course, the forests have been very quiet. There haven't been tourists for the past 2 years, so it's a great time to consider a visit. So first, what I want to do is I want to share with you a few of my top picks for places you can consider visiting when you're coming to Borneo. To be honest with you, I have a lot of favorite spots in Borneo, and if I was going to put everywhere I recommend up on this map, it wouldn't be legible. So I've just highlighted a few spots here, and I'll show you some of the things that you can see at these places. Bako National Park is very close to where I live. This is a sort of rocky peninsula. It's Sarawak's oldest national park, and it's very famous in the state for being one of the few parks that wildlife is very habituated to visitors. There's no hunting, of course, because it's an isolated peninsula, so the animals have learned that there's no threat from people, and because of this, you can get very close to a lot of the wildlife. Of course, one of the big highlights is the endemic proboscis monkey, which is only found in Borneo, and Bako National Park is a great place to see this animal. Nearby is another one of my favorite parks, also just on the outskirts of Kuching, Kuba National Park. I have way too many photos to share of this park, but I just wanted to bring it up very quickly. For those of you who are interested in macro photography, Kuba is really one of the best places, in my opinion, on the planet for macro photography. Fantastic insects, incredible diversity of frogs and reptiles. It's an amazing rainforest to visit. A bit further to the north in Sarawak is Mulu National Park. This is a very large park of pristine rainforest and steep, rugged limestone mountains, and the second highest peak in the state. A lot of people come to Mulu National Park because it's famous for its caves, and for good reason. They have incredible, enormous chambers. Some of the longest limestone caves in the world are found here. Really interesting to explore. But if you enjoy the rainforest like I do, Mulu National Park is also one of my top picks in the world. And in fact, I think it's a shame that people go here predominantly for the caves, because the rainforest here is actually on par with some of the best. Now, this is in terms of macro photography, especially many, many species of frogs. I think Mulu, if I'm not mistaken, has the highest frog diversity of any park in Borneo, including endemic species which are found only in this park, such as the very rare Mulu horned frog. This is one of only a few photos of this species. And of course, a myriad of insects in the rainforest here. Mulu is one of the parks where you won't see a lot of larger mammals, not like Bako National Park. But when you take the time to go through the forest slowly, you'll see it is full of incredible treasures, like these army ants here moving their colony. In the tiny country of Brunei, there is a wonderful national park that has my vote for one of the best canopy walkways I've ever been on anywhere on the planet. This is Ulu Temburong National Park. And the canopy walkway here is true to its name. It really is in the canopy of the forest. There are a lot of canopy walkways that only go halfway up through the forest, and you miss a lot still what's in the upper canopy. This is a canopy walkway that is freestanding, and you can actually get up to the height of the tallest trees in the forest. So in this way, you're able to be eye level with a lot of the birds and other wildlife that you would never see down on the forest floor, such as this white-crowned hornbill. Now, no list of top spots in Borneo would be complete without mentioning Danam Valley in eastern Sabah. This is, again, in the northeastern corner of Borneo. And this is some of the quintessential lowland rainforest in Borneo. It's a great place for an introduction to what Borneo looked like 200 years ago before any logging was done. So the forest is of incredible stature. It's great for birds, for quite a few larger mammals. As I showed you, the clouded leopard photo earlier was taken in Danam Valley. This is the endemic Bornean bristlehead. It's not only endemic to Borneo, but it's the only member of its family. So it's the whole family is endemic to Borneo. Of course, Danam Valley is also a great place to see another thing that Borneo is famous for, and that is the wealth of gliding animals. Borneo has more species of gliding animals than anywhere else on the planet. We have, of course, these famous gliding lizards, of which there are about a dozen species. There are flying frogs, parachuting geckos, even flying snakes. And this is, of course, not to mention the mammals, such as the flying squirrels and the misnamed flying lemur, which is actually more appropriately called the colugo. So an incredible diversity of gliding creatures. You can see a lot of other wildlife in Danam Valley as well, such as the maroon langur, or sometimes called the red leaf monkey. These are pretty much endemic to Borneo as well. Now, before I close, I want to talk about a few tips on how you can get the most out of your visit to the island of Borneo. And this applies, of course, to Borneo, but it also applies to tropical rainforests on anywhere else. First off, this is get to know your subject. Secondly, take your time. Third, embrace the night. And fourth, be a sponge. So first off, get to know your subject. Now, this is obvious. I think it applies to all wildlife photography anywhere. You need to learn about your subject if you have a particular query in mind. And the more you know about its behavior, the more likely you are able to capture the photo that you're interested in. But this is particularly true in tropical rainforests, where it is extremely complex, three-dimensional environment. It's not like an open plain where wildlife can be spotted several hundred meters away. Anything that does not want to be seen in the rainforest can easily hide. And so it's especially important to learn as much as you can about your subject before even attempting to find it. Bird watching in a lot of other places is done mostly by binocular or spotting scope. In the rainforests in Borneo, your first tool for bird watching is your ears, because a lot of times you're only hearing species that are calling either from up in the canopy or hidden in the dense undergrowth. So again, your knowledge is key to being able to get photos of species you want to. I just wanted to share this photo here because this is a photo that I had planned, that I'd wanted to take for many years, and I had to learn about my subject before I was able to get this image. This is a short-nosed fruit bat flying into a fig tree to feed, to take a fig away and eat it somewhere else. And I had to learn which species of figs that these bats prefer and how they approach these. So this photo, in fact, was actually taken in my backyard. And after I learned, I'd observed these bats feeding on this species of figs, which grow, wild in nature reserves right behind my house. I planted a seedling of this tree with the hope that it would attract bats. And fortunately, it's a very fast growing tree. And within a few years, the bats were coming in to feed on this. And that's how I was able to obtain this photograph.
That's amazing.
This is another very rare species that we were only able to track down because of prior research. This is the almost legendary Bornean lungless frog. It's the only frog in the world that is known to have no lungs, and it lives only in pristine, super clear, cold, fast-moving streams in a very small corner of Borneo. And only by doing our research beforehand were we able to pinpoint an appropriate area to explore. And we had to know exactly which type of streams it lived in. And this is a very, very, very rare species. In fact, this photo is only of the 18th known documented specimen. So it was a very special opportunity to be able to find this species in its natural habitat. Number 2 of my tips is to take your time. Again, this applies to photography everywhere, but I think it's especially true in the complex environment of the rainforest where everything is trying to hide. A lot of people that we bring into the rainforest, if it's their first time, one of their first comments is, looking around and saying, well, where are all the animals? They're really surprised that they thought it was like the Discovery Channel and you see, colorful birds flying left and right. But in fact, the rainforest is very different than that. And the reality is most things are trying to hide from you. So really, you need to slow down a lot if you want to be able to see creatures that would normally remain hidden. This means looking on the undersides of leaves where a leaf katydid may be hiding. And the slower you go, the more you will find that you will see. In fact, sometimes we can spend hours just in a very small patch of forest, just exploring everything we can find there. One of my great fascinations and a subject I particularly like to photograph are camouflaged creatures. And these are species that some of them are so incredibly camouflaged with their backgrounds that they're very difficult to see unless you know where to look. So having the experience helps a lot. But even if you know, you still have to go extremely slow. I'm not sure everybody can see this here, but this is the Bornean horned frog right here in this portion of the photo here. My third tip is to embrace the night. Now, a lot of people have been on night walks into forests, but really this is a fundamental tool for experiencing the Bornean rainforest. And in fact, if you predominantly expect to go out into the rainforest in the daytime and walk around photographing what you see, you're going to miss out on the greater portion of creatures that live there, because a lot of species only come out after nightfall, and you're never going to see them in the daytime at all. So night walks are something that we do all the time in the forest here. This is a small nocturnal primate called the western tarsier. It's not endemic to Borneo, but Borneo is a great place to see these. And there are other things in the night as well that may not be revealed in the daytime, such as the spores being released from a clump of mushrooms. So I really recommend, above all else, to get into the forest at night if you can. Now, my fourth tip is be a sponge. Now, this requires a little explanation. I mean this both literally and metaphorically. First off, of course, when you go into the forest in Borneo, you're going to be a sponge whether you like it or not. I mean, in 10 minutes of walking, you are drenched in sweat and the humidity, and you're basically soaking up everything. But what I really mean by this is being a sponge, being able to be open to everything in the forest that's around you. And this is something that I find I personally have to remind myself a lot of the time. And speaking from the perspective of being a wildlife photographer for 20 years now, it's very easy to get tunnel vision and caught up in the focus of obtaining a particular photo of a particular species that you are wanting to see. And when we have this tunnel vision, we are almost neglecting everything else that's around us in the forest. And it's a really big shame, because the tropical rainforests have so much to teach us. And so I try to remind myself really what it is, why we do nature photography in the first place. And that is, first and foremost, a deep love, passion, and reverence for nature. And the rainforest is a great place to experience this. One of the things you'll find that if you inevitably will be disappointed, like you didn't find your clouded leopard or you didn't see this rare bird that you had been looking for, is that there is always something else to see in the forest. And there are so many incidents where I have not found what I was looking for, but I've come away with a completely different encounter that I really treasure. And so it's very important to remember to be open to everything in the forest. One of the experiences that really stands out for me is this encounter with a clouded leopard. This was a face-to-face encounter with this leopard. And this happened actually just a few years ago. I had been guiding a group on the Kinabatangan River in Sabah with the main purpose of tracking down Borneo's pygmy elephants. And we went a long way up this river specifically looking for these elephants, and we couldn't find them. And it was very frustrating. We had searched all morning. So as a consolation, we pulled the boat to the side of the river and we started having, our breakfast. We had some coffee and tea, just as, because we had nothing else to do. Now, while we were having breakfast, something was happening in the forest on the other side of the river. And my attention was very quickly drawn to this. All the birds and the monkeys as well were calling out warning cries. And it was very unusual. We saw hornbills, we saw long-tailed macaques, and they were all in this one patch of forest making a huge ruckus. And it was persisting for quite a while. So as everybody finished up their breakfast, I motioned to the boatman that we should go over and have a look and see what was going on in this forest here. So we got over to the other side of the river, and of course, on the banks of the river there, with all the sunlight, the vegetation is completely dense. You can't see anything that's going on inside. But we could see the animals up at the top. They were calling at something. So we poked the nose of the canoe into the forest and hopped ashore to go and look into the forest. And lo and behold, there was a clouded leopard just sitting there in the tree. And
Wow.
It sat there calmly for a while for us to take a few photos before it left. But that to me reminds me a lot that even though you don't find what you're looking for, it's always important to be aware of other things that are happening around you in the rainforest.
Yeah.
So that ties up my talk. I hope I've given you a good overview of what makes Borneo such a special place for wildlife photography. What are some of the challenges to photograph here, and hopefully given you some inspiration to consider making a trip to Borneo yourself if you haven't done so already. This is my contact information here. I know we're going to have a question and answer session now, but if we don't cover anything that I mentioned in my talk, you're welcome to contact me privately. So I'd like to thank again Paws Trails, and particularly Hermes and Nasha, for inviting me to present here tonight. It's been a real honor to be able to share a little bit of my corner of the world, and I really look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shane.
This is
I don't think
unbelievable.
somebody can explain Borneo better than this.
When I think about Borneo, I only think about orangutans and a few other monkeys. This was an eye opener. This is unbelievable. So thank you so much. I'm literally out of words. I don't know what to say. It was a visual treat.
Oh,
It
great.
was.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, I guess we'll be seeing you here before long then.
I'm sure.
Good.
We are bombarded with questions. I have.
Yes.
It's going to take a while.
Okay. Well, it's
Yeah.
we'll try to handle as many as we can here. It's getting close to midnight here, but
So
Yeah.
sorry.
We'll quickly.
Yeah.
So with regards to the bat image you have shown, what is the setup you have used? Like, can you please explain the setup for your bat picture?
The bat photos.
Yes.
Yes. So I think I showed 2 bat photos, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Yes.
The one approaching the flower and the other approaching the figs.
Yes.
Both of those were done with a similar setup. I'm using an infrared trigger. It's different from the trigger I use for the terrestrial camera traps. This is a beam trigger. It's not a passive infrared trigger. So it's more precise, and it also has a faster response time. So that's hooked up, of course, directly to the DSLR, and then multiple flashes. For bats in particular, where you are trying to freeze the motion of the wings, you need to use flashes at a very low setting. In other words, maybe only 1/64th of full power. And that means that the flash will be only a second. Oh, sorry, we lost you for a second. Did everything?
Yeah.
Everything went black there for a minute. Okay. So yeah, there's several different techniques you need to do to get bat photos like that.
Great. And is there a census for a clouded leopard in Borneo?
Oh, good question. Yes. There have been several clouded leopard surveys. I wish I had numbers on the top of my head to give you. But there have been some estimates put forth on clouded leopard home range size and density in some areas. There are a lot of areas where clouded leopards still have a very good foothold in forest. Obviously, unfortunately, other places they are being hunted. We have incidents where clouded leopards turn up in the meat markets in the middle of Borneo. So that's really unfortunate. But there are also a lot of areas where they are very well protected. So it's hoped that the populations in those areas are still very sustainable.
Okay. You were mentioning about the elephant that came to your camera trap and tried to destroy. So Nitin is asking, is that primarily due to the species being disturbed with a flash?
I don't know. The trail cams that my friends have used don't have flashes. These are ones that have invisible. If they're shooting in the daytime, there's no flash at all, and at night, the only light they put out is an infrared light, which is invisible to the animals. So they have no visible flashes, and the elephants destroy them nonetheless. And one of my friends, he had two traps on either side of the trail, basically to photograph clouded leopards, because you need to see the flanks of the cat to be able to identify the individual. And when he retrieved the trap, there was only one trap remaining, and the other trap was gone. There were just a few pieces of plastic on the ground. And when he looked at the photos, there was a photo of a sun bear clamping down and chewing the other trap into little pieces. So why the animals do this, it's not known. Elephants, some people say they may have a grudge. They destroy anything that has human scent, but we don't know what all the motive is. To be honest, I'm happy to take losses due to animals. It's much more reassuring to have a camera destroyed by an animal than it is to have it stolen by a poacher, for example.
You're right. Yeah. Another question is, are there any birds of prey in this rainforest?
Oh, yes, there are. There's a lot of eagles, hawks, a few falcons. Yes, plenty. We have, let's see, on the top of my head, I think there's only one endemic raptor. That's the mountain serpent eagle, which is found in the higher mountains of northern Borneo. But most of the raptors are species that are found elsewhere in Southeast Asia.
Okay. What would be the minimal time you recommend for traveling to Borneo?
Bare minimum, I would say you want 2 weeks, but that's a short amount. Honestly, it depends how far you're traveling. If you're coming all the way from Canada, like Nisha would be, you need more time. Maybe 3 or 4 weeks.
Okay.
First, if you're like me, first 2 days you're destroyed by jet lag anyway. So, yeah, I would plan for longer time. It does take time to get from site to site, unfortunately. Some of the locations like Mulu, you have to fly there. Others like Danam Valley, you fly to the East Coast and then you have several hours on a dirt road. So it does take time to get around. I know I showed photos of these treacherous logging roads and going upriver by boat. That's only into the far interior of Borneo. In fact, if you're planning a trip, you do well to visit the national parks, particularly in the areas that I mentioned, like Malaysian Borneo, which has a good road system, reliable domestic flights, and good access to these national parks. So if you're on a limited time frame, those are the areas I'd recommend targeting first and foremost.
Okay. Another question. May I know who was the botanist that discovered the Thismia in Borneo?
Discovered the flower. That was Odoardo Beccari in the mid-19th century. He's actually a very famous Italian botanist who, in fact, recently here in Kuching at one of the national parks, we've just honored his contribution to botany by setting up an interpretive trail called the Beccari Trail. But at his time, when he visited Borneo, it took several days of walking to reach these rainforests that we can now get to in a 30-minute vehicle drive. And he discovered so many new species that now bear his name. That Thismia flower is one of his findings.
Okay. Gerard is saying, thanks, Chien. The clouded leopard photo brought back memories. I don't know if.
Oh,
maybe...
good. Yes. Yes, he was on our trip. That's right. We
Okay.
were in the boat together that day. Yeah, that was a very special time. Hi, Gerd.
Adriana is asking, do you organize expeditions?
Yes, I do. Well, before COVID, of course. All our trips have been canceled for the past 2 years. You can find more about the trips we do on my website or through the Instagram handle. Normally, to be honest, I only do a few Borneo trips a year. We do a lot of trips to other rainforests, uh, New Guinea, Madagascar. So it's not just Borneo, but Borneo is one of my favorite places. So you're always welcome to join us here.
Great. How to protect ourselves from insect bites or wild animal attack during the rainforest photography?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, insect bites are not a particular problem in Borneo. There are some places where mosquitoes are more numerous. Um, Ironically enough, you get more mosquitoes near towns and villages than you do deep in the rainforest, unless you happen to be in a swamp. So insect bites are not a huge problem. Dressing appropriately and bringing repellent if you need it is fine. The leeches, it's something you just get used to. We often wear what we call leech socks, which cover your ankles and they prevent the leeches from getting into your toes where they just make a mess. So if you're concerned about them, you can wear leech socks. But as far as attacks from wild animals, that we should be so lucky that we get to see an animal that close in the first place. But there's very few animals. This is not Africa. There's nothing in the forest really that's going to consider you as a prey item. We do have crocodiles in the larger rivers in Borneo. That's probably the most dangerous animal that they do consume people from time to time. So just stay away from those waterways and don't go swimming in those places. Elephants, of course, can be dangerous anywhere. And, the Borneo pygmy elephant is not as pygmy as you might think. They are still the largest animal in the forest. And in fact, somebody was killed by one several years ago because they got too close to a lone bull in the forest.
Oh.
So you have to give them a lot of respect. But elephants are only in a small corner of Borneo. And if you go to those areas, usually you're accompanied with a guide anyway, and they'll know when you're getting close to the elephants. So you have to be aware of that.
Okay.
How about
Paul
any
is
snakes?
Paul is
sorry?
asking Paul has a similar question. What about the sighting of snake species?
Yeah, snakes. We have a wonderful diversity of snakes here. Actually, proportionately, a very small number of species are dangerously venomous. We just have a handful of coral snakes, kraits, vipers, a couple cobras. We have the king cobra, but it's quite rare in Borneo. Of course, anywhere you go that has venomous snakes, you have the same concern. You just watch where you're stepping. But terrestrial venomous snakes are not particularly common in Borneo. My wife and I just came back from Costa Rica, where venomous terrestrial snakes is a constant concern in the rainforests there. You're usually wearing long boots to begin with, but you don't just go tramping off the trail through the forest without looking very carefully where you're stepping, because the fer-de-lance viper it does cause a lot of very serious bites and fatalities, and it's something that you always have to be aware of in forests like that. We don't really have an equivalent in Borneo. There is one lowland terrestrial viper, but it's not a common species at all. You have to really spend a lot of time in the forest even to see one. So, Costa Rica, in a week we'd seen 5 fer-de-lance. So it's very different.
How do you ensure that the nocturnal animals' eyes aren't affected by the flashlight?
Oh yeah, good question. So this is a concern as well. A lot of people, not just flash, but using any bright lights as well. You have to be, of course, cognizant of any stress you're causing to your subjects. This is something true for any type of photography. If you're eliciting a stress response, or if you can tell, for example, we annually we sponsor an event called the Bornean Frog Race, which is a public awareness event to get youth and basically everybody out into the forest to photograph frogs as sort of a race to document species. And in cases like this, we have rules where you are limited to photographing a single frog no more than 3 times with flash, and that is to limit the number of exposures that the animal receives. Now, not all creatures are respond the same way to flash. Some, some insects are almost impervious. They're either blind or light makes no effect on them at all. So it's a case by case scenario. Other creatures are much more affected.
Okay. One last question. Would like to ask if you would recommend photographers to take up wildlife handling courses, as some photography involve handling the species.
Yeah, this is a touchy subject. A lot of photographers prefer not to handle wildlife at all. It depends on what your approach is. Personally, I don't condone handling of any wildlife if it can be avoided. I know that there are a lot of people that they stage photos of animals, they capture animals and then place them to photograph them. I personally, I don't enjoy this type of photography. I think it can convey a false sense about the animal's behavior, particularly if it's been placed in a position it wouldn't normally be in. Yeah. But you're also causing stress to the animal. So in any case where it's possible, you photograph the animal without any handling at all. Now, if you are a researcher and you're handling wildlife anyway, this is a completely different story. And yes, you probably will have received some training for handling wildlife in those cases. And if you're taking photos as well, that's a special case scenario. But it depends entirely on what your purpose is.
You have an offer from Singapore. Are you interested to do an exhibition in Singapore in our Sarawak trade?
In Sarawak?
Yeah.
Oh, Trade and Tourism Office. Wow. Sure, why not? Yes, please be in touch. We have I have an exhibition coming up. Well, we actually currently have an exhibition in Kuala Lumpur, but there'll be another one, and I'm doing an exhibition on camouflage and mimicry of rainforest organisms later this year in Kuala Lumpur. But happy to look into the possibility of doing one in Singapore. That would be very nice.
Yeah,
thank you.
And one more question. May I ask if it is rare to find symbiotic relationship between nepenthes and amphibians?
Yeah, interesting question. Yeah. Pitcher plants have been a real fascination of mine. In fact, that's one of the reasons I initially moved to Borneo, was a love of pitcher plants. And quite a few frogs have been found having an association with pitcher plants. They weren't pictured in my talk, but about 10, 12 years ago, there was a remarkable frog that was published as a new species from Borneo by a friend of mine. And this is the tiniest frog in Borneo, Microhyla nepenthicola. There were some disputes several years regarding its taxonomy. Some people had argued it had previously been described, but it seems to be a good, valid species. And this is also another frog that lives and breeds only inside pitcher plants. So chances are more species will be found, like the one I showed in my talk, and like this other tiny one, because these pitcher plants, they're a perfect habitat. They've got water in places far away from streams. But if you're interested in that subject, I'd recommend looking up some of the other interesting animal relationships with pitcher plants. It's not just frogs, but there are some pitcher plants which have mutualistic relationships with small mammals. For example, there are a few species of pitcher plants which basically function as latrines for small mammals like tree shrews and rats. And the animals will leave their droppings in the pitcher, and in return, they receive some nectar from the lid of the pitcher. So the plant gets nutrition and the animal gets sugar. There's even a bat that uses pitcher plants as a roost and will seek out this particular species of pitcher plant to sleep inside. And it seems this pitcher plant is depending on the bat for nutrition as well. So a lot of fantastic stories. In fact, stories like this are one of the things that make really paint the real diversity of the Bornean rainforest. It's not just the individual species, but it's the relationships, the mutual relationships between these species that shows how they're dependent on one another, that really tell some of the most fascinating stories about the rainforest.
Great.
Amazing.
Okay,
There are
now
so many more
we
questions, but yeah,
we should leave you to sleep.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shane.
Past my bedtime, but it's a pleasure to be
Yes.
here regardless. Yeah.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
definitely we'll be in touch.
Okay. Thank you very much. Look forward to more talks on Paws trails in the future.
Sure.
Yes. And please be in touch if you're coming to
Sure,
Borneo
sure.
yourselves. Would love to meet up in
Yes.
person. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Take care.
Good night, everybody.
Sorry, we couldn't go through all the questions.
Yeah,
As
I think we missed few questions as well
a bunch of questions. I think.
because it's already 12 in the midnight for Shane to sleep. Yeah, he was kind enough to join us, and at this point of time, especially,
Yeah, it
so
was
the
an
timing was a
interesting
bit,
one.
yeah, very like
Knowledgeable
Yeah,
and visual treat. And it's a combination of science, art, and the conversation. It was amazing.
yes, and very interesting conversations.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, so this session we end here.
When is
Amazing.
the next one?
Yes, when the next one is, I think next week.
Next week. I hope it's as interesting as this one.
Let's hope. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for being on the show. We'll see you next week with another wonderful person. Till then, take care. Bye.